Welcome back, Thresholds and Transits. Today we are talking about Mercury retrograde in Pisces and why this one hits differently. And this is, I think, the 8th time that I have pressed record on this video. So before I say this is going to be a different Mercury retrograding, Mercury stationing like right about now, and I'm really glad that this is the final attempt at recording this video. So I also usually roll my eyes at mention of Mercury retrograde and Mercury retrograde content. Not because I don't believe in it, but because what's put out there in pop astrology is surface level. Back up your laptop and don't sign contracts and expect delays. And Mercury retrograde is this astrology's version of a weather warning. Everything that happens about structure or computers or flights is blamed on Mercury. It's boring. But here's the thing, every few years a Mercury retrograde comes along that isn't about just your laptop. It isn't primarily about your flight being delayed, though that may happen. It isn't about your email going to the wrong person, even though that might happen. It's about something happening at a much deeper level in the structure of collective reality, in the way that we know what we know, and in the stories we tell ourselves about what's true. This is one of those retrogrades. If you don't know me, my name is Megan. I am an astrology student and I'm learning so many things and I want to share them with you. One, because the best way to learn is to teach, but two, I'm also building a platform. And recently my teacher said it is time to start putting out content and then to start accepting donation readings. So I am offering donation readings on my website, meganriley.eu, and there's an astrology tab. You can click on that and schedule a free reading. Those are for anyone, any gender. There's other things on the website. If you are so interested, you could go have a look. I'm really proud of them. And there should be times, I live in Greece, so I'm in Eastern European time, but I've also opened up times all throughout the day. And I usually am working at the end of my day, which will, for those of you in the US, the beginning of yours. And if there is not something that works with your schedule, just send me an email and we will find something. And that's megan@meganriley.eu. Okay, back to the retrogrades. So this is one of those retrogrades. And I want to explain first the astrology mechanics, because I think when we understand why this placement is so unusual, the rest of it lands differently. I want to ground in what's actually happening in the world right now, because this transit is not happening in a vacuum. I also want to bring in a lineage of thinkers and mystics, mostly women, who have been navigating exactly this kind of terrain for centuries, long before we had a word for it. So let's go. Let's start from the ground up, because I don't want to assume everyone listening has the same foundation. Mercury retrograde is not a disaster. It is not a curse. It is an optical illusion. 3 to 4 times a year, Mercury appears to slow down, stop, and reverse direction across the sky. The planet isn't actually moving backwards. No planet ever does. What's happening is a matter of relative speed. Mercury orbits the sun much faster than the Earth does. Think of 2 cars on a highway. When a faster car passes a slower one, the slower one appears to move backward relative to the faster car, even if it's still moving forward. That's Mercury retrograde. We're in the slower car. Mercury zooms by us, and from our vantage point, it looks like it's going backwards. In astrology, apparent motion matters. The symbolism is in the experience, not the physics. And experientially, when Mercury retrograde is in effect, things in Mercury's domain tend to go sideways. Mercury is the planet of communication in all forms: speaking, listening, writing, reading, negotiating, thinking. It also rules travel, commerce, technology, contracts, and the movement of information. It governs mechanisms by which we exchange meaning with each other. So when Mercury appears to reverse, the things it governs tends to experience reversals too. Messages get lost, Conversations scramble, technology fails, contracts turn out to have been misunderstood by all parties, travel plans unravel, people from the past even resurface, because Mercury retrograde is inherently a backward-looking time. It's a revisitation, a review, going back. So none of this is catastrophic. It's inconvenient, sometimes annoying, sometimes really disruptive, but it also is consistently instructive. The disruptions during Mercury retrograde are almost always pointing at something that wasn't clear or finished to begin with. The email that goes to the wrong person usually contains something that needed to be said differently. The contract that falls apart usually had a clause that wasn't properly understood. The trip that gets derailed usually has something to show that you weren't expecting. Mercury retrograde is a cosmic edit button, not a punishment. Now, all of that is standard. The question is, why does this sign that Mercury retrograde through matter so much? Think of Mercury as a worker who is very good at a specific set of tasks. It's excellent at precision and analysis and data and categorization, clear reasoning, sequential logic. It speaks the language of the spreadsheet, the contract, the thesis statement. It's the part of your mind that knows how to break a problem down into steps. Now imagine that worker being sent to do their job in a completely alien environment, not a difficult environment, an alien one. One where the rules are completely different, where the tools don't function the same way, the very nature of the terrain undermines the skills they're most confident in. That's Mercury in Pisces. To understand what Pisces actually is, let's look at traditional astrology charts, not with Aries, but with Cancer. In the Thema Mundi, the ancient teaching art that shows the cosmos as if it was the moment of creation, Cancer rises on the eastern horizon. That makes Cancer the beginning, the foundation, the home, the root of the whole system. And from Cancer as the ascendant, Pisces falls in the 9th house, the house of philosophy, higher knowledge, long journeys, belief systems, and the sacred. This is not a placement of weakness. The 9th house is where we reach toward the divine, where we ask the largest questions, where knowing becomes wisdom rather than just information. Pisces, in this frame, is the sign most concerned with the highest order of understanding. It governs what we believe at the deepest level and why. That matters enormously for what Mercury retrograde in Pisces is actually doing. The transit isn't about disrupting logistics. It's disrupting epistemology, the question of how we know what we know and whether we think we know is actually true. That's the 9th house. That is Pisces and its most essential expression. In the more familiar tropical framework, Aries begins in the zodiac. Pisces lands in the 12th house, the house of the hidden and unconscious and dissolving and places of retreat and undoing. Both frames are true simultaneously, and the combination tells the complete story. Pisces is the sign where knowledge reaches its highest aspiration, and it's also where it loses its edges, dissolves into something that can no longer be named. It's the philosopher's house and the mystic's cave at once. In traditional astrological terms, Mercury is in detriment and in fall in Pisces. Those are the two most significant forms of planetary weakness. Detriment means a planet that is in the sign opposite to where it's most at home. For Mercury, that's in Virgo, the sign of precision and analysis and refinement. Pisces in Virgo is opposite in every way. Fall means a planet that is the sign opposite its exaltation, where it was most honored and empowered. So for Mercury, that exaltation is also in Virgo. So Pisces hits Mercury twice from both directions. Here's an important nuance though. Being in detriment or fall doesn't mean the planet is broken. It means it's working in a mode that doesn't come naturally. And astrologer Stephen Forrest wrote, "These positions aren't necessarily bad. They're about complexity and paradox. A Mercury in Pisces doesn't lack intelligence. It lacks the kind of intelligence that Western culture has spent centuries treating as the only kind of intelligence." One source put it, Mercury in Pisces represents the moment when the spiritually evolved person can begin to transcend the concrete mind and start to function on the plane of pure reason and intuition. The phrase I love is pure reason and intuition, not or, both simultaneously beyond the division that we've been taught to maintain. The shadow side is real. Mercury in Pisces can produce self-deception and wishful thinking and difficulty with precision and susceptibility to other people's emotions, confusion, a tendency to hear what we want to hear rather than what's said, and a blurring of the line between imagination and reality. These are the things to watch out for. And then Mercury goes retrograde in this already challenging placement. So he's been traveling through Pisces in a challenging placement, and now today, the 25th, is stationing. The confusion deepens, the tendencies get amplified, the fog thickens. So understand that this retrograde is not just about logistics. Yes, the technology will be annoying. Yes, communication will scramble, but the deeper disruption happening right now is in the realm of collective perception, in how we understand what's real, what's true, what we know, and how we know it. So let's sideways, one sec, and understand why Mercury retrograde in Pisces matters politically and collectively. Let's look at something called epistemology. Excuse me. Epistemology is the brand of philosophy that asks not what is true, but how do we know it's true? It's concerned with the mechanisms of knowledge itself, what counts as valid evidence, who gets to make the knowledge claims, and whose way of arriving at the truth gets treated as legitimate. Now, for most of Western history, let's say from the 17th century to now, the dominant answer to these questions has been rational, empirical, measurable, reproducible knowledge is real knowledge if you can quantify it and document it and test it under controlled conditions, submit it for peer review, and arrive at the same result regardless of who's doing the testing. That's knowledge. If you can't, it's opinion, anecdote, superstition, or feeling. This framework has produced enormous value. But feminist philosophers of knowledge, thinkers like Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, and the authors of the 1986 book Women's Ways of Knowing by Belinkie, Clinchy, Goldberger, and Terrell have been pointing out for decades that this framework isn't neutral. It's positioned as universal, but it was constructed by a particular group of people, mostly white, mostly Western, mostly male, mostly elite, and it systematically excludes or devalues the way of knowing that other groups rely on. Patricia Hill Collins, in her book Feminist, Black Feminist Thought, made this explicit. She wrote, "Epistemology investigates the standards used to assess knowledge, or why we believe what we believe to be true. Far from being the apolitical study of truth, epistemology points to the ways in which power relations shaped who is believed and why." The last phrase, not who is known, not what is known, who is believed and why. That question, who is believed, is the 9th house question. It lives in the domain of Pisces, in the house of philosophy and sacred knowledge, and which is exactly where Mercury is retrograding. She's stationing today. Collins describes what she calls an ethic of caring as a valid approach, one where personal expressiveness and empathy and the capacity for connection are ways of generating real knowledge, not obstacles to it. She contrasts this with what she calls the ethic of personal accountability, embedded in Western academic knowledge production, which treats the knower as essentially interchangeable and the emotional state of the knower as irrelevant to the quality of knowledge. Belenky and colleagues found that their research on women's development that many women went through a phase that they call subjective knowing, a moment of turning away from the external authorities and toward their inner voice, their intuition, and a felt sense of primary sources of truth. In the dominant Western framework, this gets coded as intellectual weakness, as regression, as an inability to think properly. Belenky and colleagues argued that it was actually a crucial development stage, a necessary reclamation in self-generated knowing. I'm spending time here because this is the intellectual framework that makes Mercury retrograde in Pisces interesting on a collective level, not just a personal one. When I say this retrograde dissolves the boundary between fact and feeling, between what we know and how we feel about what we know, that dissolution hits differently depending on where you're standing. For those whose ways of knowing have always been treated as legitimate, this dissolution feels disorienting. For those whose ways of knowing have always been dismissed as illegitimate, this dissolution is an opening. But let's go and talk larger picture about this retrograde. So here's a piece of context that most retrograde coverage is ignoring, and I think it's one of the most important pieces. To understand why this particular retrograde is so unusual, you have to understand what just happened in the larger astrological sky. Neptune, the planet of dreams and illusions and boundaries that dissolve and collective spiritual longing, has been moving through Pisces since 2011. Neptune is the modern ruler of Pisces, which means this is in its home sign, the place where it's most powerful, most at home, most concentrated, and most itself. Neptune takes 165 years to orbit the sun. It spends roughly 14 years in each sign. The last time it was in Pisces before this transit was 1847 to 1862, which overlapped with the Civil War, the American Civil War, the spiritualist movement, explosion in popularity, the rise of transcendentalism, and what some historians call the first wave of organized mysticism in the English-speaking world. Now, Neptune just left Pisces again. On January 26th, Neptune moved into Aries, where it will remain until 2039. This is an enormous shift, and it's directly relevant to Mercury retrograde. Mercury is now retrograding through Pisces. It's stationary today, moving backward through that sign. And at the precise moment, Neptune just vacated it. So think about what that means. Neptune spent 15 years in Pisces, building up the Piscean energy, saturating the sign with the dissolution and the dreaminess and the boundary permeability and the fog. And now, right as Neptune exits, Mercury comes back to gather what's left. So this is the last exhale of a 165-year cycle. And Mercury is walking directly through it, backwards. So Neptune and Pisces actually produce in our collective experience. When Neptune entered Pisces in April 2011, social media was beginning its transformation from a communication tool into something more like immersive alternative reality. Instagram launched in 2010. The early 2010s saw the explosion of filtered identity, curated self-presentation, and the performance of life rather than the living of life. Astrologer Christy Gray said this was more intuitive than assertive, more reflective than active. We've been searching for meaning. More specifically, the line between real and constructed reality started blurring in ways that were entirely new. Not just in personal identity, but in politics, in news, in our shared sense of what's happening in the world. The term post-truth was Oxford's word of the year in 2016. Cambridge harvested data from 87 million Facebook profiles to build psychological profiles for targeted political manipulation in 2018. QAnon emerged in 2017 and grew into a mass movement built entirely on fog. The premise that reality is not what it appears and the hidden truth requires special access. All of this is Neptune and Pisces. the dissolution of the agreed upon real, the collective inability to distinguish the image from the thing it represents, the longing for a spiritual authority that could cut through the confusion, which, when unfulfilled, gets weaponized by demagogues who offer themselves as the only source. Now, Neptune has left. The fog is lifting, or rather, the source of the fog moved on. But the fog itself isn't clear, and Mercury is retrograding through the residue of 15 years of Neptunian, Piscean dissolution energy this week. So let's do numbers and stories. We're in the middle of what researchers are calling a collapse of trust, a collective breakdown in our ability to agree on what's real. In January of this year, researchers at Stanford and other institutions described the situation with AI-generated media as having crossed a threshold. The specific language was that it will essentially become impossible to look at a video and know whether it's real or synthetic. The point, which Jeff Hancock at Stanford called already nearly upon us, represents something profound: the elimination of a category of evidence we have relied on for basic reality testing for almost 2 centuries. Within the first 2 weeks of 2026, this was the news. A federal immigration officer shot Renee Good in her car. Within hours, AI images of the scene were circulating on social media, indistinguishable on emotional impact from the real footage. People were reasoning from synthetic evidence about a real event and could not tell the difference. The Epstein files were released, some of them, and immediately spawned hundreds of completely fabricated claims. The emotional charge of both was identical. Political communications from the highest levels of the U.S. government are being delivered in a deliberately vague, emotionally saturated register. Trump saying that the world will find out over the next probably 10 days whether the U.S. will attack Iran. That's not information. It's designed to generate anxiety without producing anything specific that can be verified or engaged with. It's Pisces Mercury weaponized at the level of nuclear geopolitics. And then there's the network of what researchers call pink slime websites, news sites that look local and look legitimate, publish biased political content, and spend significant money on social media advertising to distribute it. The markup has documented these sites operating in multiple U.S. states. Readers cannot distinguish from them and real local journalism. The container of news is intact, but what's inside has been replaced. This is the landscape Mercury is retrograding through, a world in which the mechanisms of establishing truth have been systematically corrupted. The tools for detecting synthetic reality are failing, and the emotional register of real information and fabricated information has been made deliberately identical. This is Mercury retrograde in Pisces. So now, this specific retrograde, and in this specific moment, is more intense than a typical Mercury retrograde in Pisces would be. So is Neptune's exit and Saturn conjunct Neptune at 0 degrees Aries on February 20th. 5 days before Mercury stations, 2 of the slowest moving planets in the solar system form an exact conjunction at the most symbolically charged degree in the entire zodiac. 0 degrees of Aries carries an enormous symbolic weight across multiple astrological traditions. In the Thema Mundi, where Cancer is the ascendant of the Cosmos, 0 degrees Aries falls in the 10th house, the house of authority, culmination, and worldly power. It is the degree where the world soul first acts with visible public force. In the tropical framework secondarily, it also marks the sun's ingress into the new solar year, a moment mundane astrologers have used for centuries to forecast the fate of kingdoms. From either direction, the degree concentrates enormous power. Saturn and Neptune don't meet very often, maybe every 36 years. The last conjunction was in 1989, which overlapped with the fall of the Berlin Wall. the dissolution of Cold War structure, and the collapse of the Soviet bloc. The one before that was in 1952 to 1953, overlapping with the end of the Korean War, the death of Stalin, and a major global realignment of power. The one before that was in 1917, overlapping the Russian Revolution. The pattern is consistent. Saturn-Neptune conjunctions coincide with major dissolutions of existing structure and the uneasy emergence of something new. Saturn is the planet of structure, reality, limitation, and accountability. Neptune is the planet of dissolution, illusion, dreams, and fog. And when they conjoin, old structures dissolve before new ones are established. There's always a gap between the ending and the beginning, the space between where the old is gone but the new hasn't arrived yet. Saturn and Neptune have not conjuncted at 0 degrees Aries in over 6,000 years. In the Thema Mundi frame, that is a conjunction in the house of worldly power that has not occurred in recorded astrological history. In the tropical frame, it is a conjunction at the 1st degree of the first solar sign. Both frameworks are pointing at the same thing. Something unprecedented is happening. That conjunction happened on February 20th. Mercury stations 5 days later, today, on February 25th. The retrograde begins in the immediate aftermath of the most historically significant planetary conjunction in our lifetime. It's like the container just broke, and now Mercury is retrograding through the residue. Jupiter retrograde in Cancer, trining Mercury 3 times. Jupiter is also retrograde right now, moving through Cancer, the sign of home and roots and memory and the past and emotional foundation. It's forming a supportive trine to Mercury that will be exact 3 times. February 16th, March 9th, and April 3rd. So this is it's really good. This is very generous. Jupiter expands what it touches, and a trine is a harmonious aspect. It flows rather than fights. Jupiter trine Mercury in this configuration supports expanded understanding, philosophical breadth, and a shift in beliefs and worldview. But it also expands what Mercury is already doing, so the confusion gets bigger. The insights also get bigger. The emotional depth of whatever's coming up during this retrograde is bigger. So it's Pisces season. The sun moved into Pisces mid-February and stays through March 20th, which is exactly the day that Mercury stations direct. The entire retrograde period is bathed in Piscean solar energy. There's no escape from this. We haven't even gotten to the fact that Mercury entered Pisces on February 6th and has been building towards this since the pre-shadow on the 11th. The influence is active for weeks. So let's bring in the feminist lens, because that's what we do here on this channel, and this is where it gets interesting. When the line between the fact and feeling dissolves, certainty breaks down and it doesn't hit everyone the same way. Consider who has been told consistently across centuries that their ways of knowing are unreliable. Women, who were considered too emotional to reason clearly. Indigenous people, whose knowledge systems were classified as superstition. Black communities, whose testimony was literally inadmissible in certain courts. And people whose spiritual or intuitive knowledge was dismissed as primitive, pathological, or dangerous. The dominant framework that rational, empirical, measurable knowledge is the only real kind was not designed for or by these groups, and it has been used systematically to delegitimize their experiences, their testimony, their understanding of their own lives. So when Mercury goes retrograde in Pisces and the dominant framework starts coming apart at the seams, when the line between fact and feeling, between the real and the constructed, starts to blur, there's a double edge. On one side, the dissolution creates perfect conditions for gaslighting. When reality itself is unstable, it becomes easier to tell people that what they experienced didn't happen, easier to say that their testimony is unreliable, easier to make them doubt themselves. This is the mechanism of abuse operating at a societal scale right now. On the other side, the dissolution also loosens the grip of framework that has been doing the delegitimizing. The fog makes it hard to see to distinguish real from fake, and the same fog that once covered the burning of women as witches. It's the same fog that called the knowledge held by indigenous healers primitive. The dissolution that feels terrifying from inside the dominant framework feels different when you've never really trusted that framework to begin with. The philosopher Miranda Fricker coined the term epistemic injustice in her 2007 book of the same name to describe what happens when a speaker suffers a wrong, specifically in their capacity as a knower. She identified two main types: testimonial injustice, when someone's testimony is given less credibility than it deserves because of their social identity, and hermeneutical injustice, when there's a gap in their collective interpretive resource that puts someone at an unfair disadvantage or understanding or expressing their own experience. This is the framework that explains why Mercury retrograde in Pisces isn't just about tech glitches. The dissolution that it produces reveals the cracks in who's been believed and why. So here's what I find to be compelling from a historical and spiritual perspective. There's an entire lineage of women who have been navigating this exact domain for centuries without a name for it. I'm talking about the tradition of women mystics, women healers, visionaries, knowledge keepers, who preserved what they knew through channels other than the official archive, because the official archive was closed. For most of Western history, women could not attend universities. They couldn't be ordained as priests or ministers. They couldn't publish under their own names, not without enormous difficulty. They couldn't own property in their own right, couldn't testify in court on equal footing with men. They couldn't hold positions in the institutions that decided what counted as legitimate knowledge. The formal mechanisms for generating and validating and transmitting knowledge were not available. They still had knowledge, but it just meant that they had to find other channels. One example of this is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess who was a mystic, composer, philosopher, healer, and theologian, who found the one door the patriarchal religious authority had left open: divine revelation. Women couldn't teach by authority, but as a Parisian master, Henry of Ghent, acknowledged around 1290, women were allowed to teach from divine favor and the fervor of charity. The Hildegard Society documented his exact formulation: women might teach just like anyone else, if she possesses sound doctrine, if it came from God rather than the woman itself. Hildegard exploited this loophole. She called herself repeatedly an unlearned woman. And the World History Encyclopedia says she worked slyly to her advantage because it made her statements that all of her writings and music came from visions of the divine to be more believable, and therefore giving Hildegard the authority to speak in a time and a place where few women were permitted a voice. Her books on natural science and medicine, Physica and Causae, documented herbal and medical knowledge that Wikipedia notes was poorly documented, as their practitioners, mainly women, rarely wrote in Latin. She preserved what women healers knew in a form that could survive. She composed music that is still performed today, a millennium later. And she did all this through a channel the institution had left open: the mystical, the visionary, the non-rational. She's not alone here. Julian of Norwich, a 14th century English mystic, wrote the first book in English to known have been written by a woman. She spent years in an anchor hold, a small cell attached to a church, praying and receiving visions, and from that enclosed space produced theology of extraordinary sophistication. Meth Child of Madberg, Teresa of Avila, Margery Kempe, the Penguins, lay women who formed religious communities outside the formal structures of the church, specifically because formal structures required male governance. All of them working in the register that the dominant framework dismissed: vision, intuition, mystical experience, and embodied knowing. All of them preserving and transmitting knowledge through channels that didn't require institutional credentialing. All of them doing what Mercury retrograde in Pisces asks, going beneath the rational, beneath the official, beneath the documented, to find out what lies underneath. This is a tradition that becomes accessible during this retrograde as a living method. The feminist sociologist Dorothy Smith described women's knowledge as bifurcated consciousness, the ability to see from two places simultaneously, from inside the dominant framework and outside it, from the position of those who serve it without being fully included in it. That bifurcation is exactly the perceptual state that Mercury retrograde in Pisces can produce, a looking again at things from a different angle, a revision. Adrienne Rich used the exact word, revision, in her 1971 essay, When the Dead Awaken, writing as revision. She defined it as the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes, of entering an old text from a new critical direction. She called it not just a critical exercise, but an act of survival, because without it, we continue to see through the frameworks that were not designed for us and mistake that seeing for neutral truth. That is this retrograde. So let's talk about March 7th because it's a very bright spot inside this retrograde and it's worth protecting. On March 7th, Mercury reaches what we call the cazimi, which comes from the Arabic phrase meaning the heart of the sun. It's the moment when Mercury is in exact conjunction with the sun, and it's so close that it's literally inside the solar corona, bathed in light. For a planet that's been retrograde and therefore in reduced function, foggy, confused, operating in a register that's really difficult for it, the cazimi is a moment of unusual clarity and power. The transition holds that a cazimi planet is not weakened, but strengthened, so close to the sun's light that it becomes radiant. In practice, this means March 7th tends to bring important messages, unexpected clarity, and moments of insight during an otherwise murky period. Dreams may be extra vivid, conversations that have been going in circles suddenly find resolution, a piece of writing that's been stuck may unstick, a question you've been carrying, you may receive an answer from an unexpected direction. This is not a day to force things, it's the day to be receptive. The clarity doesn't always come in what you expect. It may be a dream image, an overheard conversation, or a song lyric, a sudden visceral understanding of something you thought you knew. The Piscean register is active here. The knowing is poetic, not propositional. So keep notebooks. Let's be super practical because I think the worst thing that I could do is leave you with a rich picture of what's happening cosmically and then nothing to do with it. The first and most important reframe, the disruptions of this retrograde are information, not punishment. When something goes wrong, when a communication scrambles or a plan falls apart or a conversation that should have been simple becomes confusing, it's pointing at something. There's something unclear that needs to be clarified. There's something unfinished that needs to be revisited. This disruption is the message. And so this is going to be especially true in this domain of information and truth-telling. When you find yourself confused about whether something is real, an image, a story, a picture, a memory, a meme, a narrative about yourself, don't immediately reach for the rational toolkit to resolve it. Sit with the confusion longer. What is it pointing at? What assumptions about reality are embedded in your certainty? And what's being exposed from the assumptions? A few areas to be careful. Contracts and formal agreements, anything that you're signing needs to be read 2 times, 3 times, extra careful, and ideally from someone else as well. Not because they're dishonest, but because the fog makes it harder to register what's actually on the page. Communications with emotional weight. If you can, wait until March 20th. If you can't, go slower than what you think you need to. Ask them to reflect back what they heard. Don't assume that what you meant is what landed. The gap between intent and reception is wider right now. Information sources. It's not a good time to make major decisions based on things that you've read on social media. Not because the information is wrong, but because your capacity for distinguishing reliable from unreliable is compromised. Everyone's is. So extra verification, anything that triggers strong emotion, because strong emotion is exactly the signal that Piscean dissolution amplifies. It may be true, it might be a deep fake. The emotional charge alone will not tell you which one. And then decisions made under duress. Mercury retrograde in Pisces has a particular way of creating false urgency. The Piscean tendency to feel overwhelmed, combined with retrograde tendency to create disruption, can make you feel like you need to decide something immediately, when you actually have more time than you think. Unless something is genuinely time sensitive, just wait. When I was living in Florida with my dad, he had to get his annual colonoscopy. And so we went, and as we were leaving, I had to drive him home because he was never out, but he had been general anesthetic. No, not local anesthetic. And the doctor said, no life-changing decisions. Or just think about that. For this time, so from today, the 25th of February, until the 20th of March, no life-changing decisions. Because like being under an anesthetic, we're just not thinking clearly. If you have to make the life-changing decision, do so with slowness. There's not urgency about it. We don't need to overreact. I'm being extra careful because I'm doing all the things that we say not to do. So I'm moving countries. I sent a package today on the 25th to arrive next week. I have to find an apartment during this time. So I'm doing all the things, but I'll just do them slower with the time. And we can all take that time. Specific areas to lean into. This is an extraordinary transit for creative work that requires access to material below the rational surface. The fiction writer who's been stuck, the songwriter whose lyrics have been too tidy, the researcher who knows that they're missing something but can't find it, the person who needs to write about something painful and hasn't been able to crack the shell. The Piscean register is porous and available and rich for anyone willing to work in it rather than against it. Dream journaling is unusually productive during this period. Keep something to write next to your bed, not to interpret what you find immediately. Mercury's difficulties with Piscean material mean your interpretive capacity is not at its most reliable, but capture it. The interpretation might come later. Right now, just capture. Revisiting old work. This is true of all retrogrades. It's a good time to go back, not forward. But with Pisces, the old work that's worth revisiting isn't necessarily something with a clear argument or structure. It might be a dream that you had 6 months ago, a conversation you've been turning over without resolution, a question that keeps appearing in different forms, a feeling that something important happened, but you didn't quite understand it. Your intuition is your primary intelligence. For this period, I want you to suggest elevating the role of your intuitive knowing in your decision making, not to the exclusion of rational analysis, but the genuine first line resource rather than a nice to have add-on. Pay attention to what your body knows before your mind does. Pay attention to what feels wrong before you can explain why. Pay attention to what draws you before you've justified that attraction. This isn't mysticism, it's appropriate technology for the environment. The Piscean environment favors knowing before knowing. Fighting is like insisting on using a hammer when the job requires water. And okay, so now into the widest frame. We are at the end of a 165-year cycle. Neptune and Pisces saturated our collective life with dissolution for 15 years. Social media transformed reality into an image. AI began to take image and reality indistinguishable. Post-truth became a cultural frame rather than an anomaly. The authority structures that used to govern adjudicate between real and false, the press and the academy, the institution, the government, have all lost their grip. So now Neptune moved into Aries, the new era is beginning, the dissolution is ending. Something requires decisiveness, directiveness, and action grounded in actual reality is beginning to emerge. But you can't reach what comes next without passing through exactly this moment, this threshold, this retrograde, this fog, the final immersion in everything that's been dissolved. The tradition of women mystics and feminine thinkers I've been drawing on throughout this whole episode understood something that dominant framework kept trying to deny, that the dissolution is not the problem. The dissolution is the prerequisite. You have to unknow before you can know. You have to lose shape of your certainty before you can inhabit a more accurate one. Adrienne Rich called this revision. The women of the medieval mystical tradition navigated it through prayer and vision and the body. The women named it as a political project, the systematic expansion of what counts as knowledge. Who counts as a knower, not why? Mercury retrograde in Pisces is handing all of us, individually and collectively, the conditions under which that kind of unknowing becomes possible. The fog is uncomfortable. The confusion is real. The disruptions are genuinely disruptive. But in the fog, things that were hidden become visible. In the dissolution of the story, other stories become audible. In the failure of the rational to contain the whole reality, the intuitive, the goddess, the embodied, the dreamed, the felt, the things that have been preserved in the underground channels begin to surface. Mercury stations retrograde on the 25th. I'm recording this on the 25th. It reaches its moment of greatest clarity, the cazimi, on March 7th. It stations direct on March 20th, the same day the sun moves into Aries. The post-shadow clears on April 9th. This retrograde lasts until March 20th, but its effects begin when the pre-shadow opened on February 11th. And if you're listening to when it's released, you're already inside the energy. But I'm going to leave you with this. The tradition that navigated this kind of fog most skillfully was not the tradition of rational certainty. It's the tradition of women and others excluded from the archive who learned to preserve knowledge in forms that could survive precisely because they couldn't be easily documented, categorized, or controlled. Who understood, long before modern philosophy gave it a name, in the highest knowing, that ninth house knowing, the Pisces knowing, does not always arrive through argument. It arrives through vision, the body, through the dream, through the long journey towards something you cannot see, but clearly can feel pulling you forward. You have access to that. It lives in your body and in your dreams and in your intuition, in the things that you know before you can explain how you know them, in the questions that keep returning in different forms, in the knowledge that the official story always leaves something out. This retrograde is asking you to trust that, not instead of critical thinking. We need critical thinking, but alongside it, as its partner, as part of the knowing that doesn't need a peer-reviewed citation to be real. We are at the end of collective dissolution. Something new is beginning.